Imagine a man living in a large ceramic jar in the middle of Athens, carrying only a lantern by day, walking the streets without clothes, mocking everyone around him. He is Diogenes of Sinope, often called the mad philosopher, a figure who both fascinated and horrified ancient Greece. He rejected wealth, comfort, social norms, and even the most basic expectations of polite society. To the people of Athens, he was insane. To some philosophers, he was a master of wisdom. And to history, he remains one of the most provocative examples of living philosophy. Diogenes' life forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to live freely? Is happiness tied to wealth and reputation, or is it something deeper? Can a person truly live according to principle in a society that prizes appearances over truth? His answers were radical, extreme, and uncompromising. Born around 412 BCE in Sinope, a Greek colony on the Black Sea, Diogenes came from a family of high status. Yet he chose, or was forced, to abandon all of it. He spent his life challenging authority, wealth, and even the institutions of philosophy itself. He rejected the idea that comfort, power, or material possessions mattered at all. While others debated ethics and virtue in the safety of their homes and schools, Diogenes turned life itself into philosophy. Every action, every word, was meant to reveal truth and expose pretense. In Athens, he became notorious for his outrageous behavior. He performed acts designed to shock, eating in public like an animal, urinating where others would see, mocking the rich, insulting prominent philosophers, and confronting kings. Every act was intentional. Every action questioned the social norms that people took for granted. Diogenes believed that most people spent their lives as slaves, not to kings or governments, but to their own desires, pride, and fear of shame. To him, society was full of illusions, and happiness came only from rejecting them. The image of Diogenes living in a barrel captures the imagination because it is so utterly countercultural. Today, we are surrounded by messages that equate success with wealth, comfort, and prestige. Diogenes' life is a direct contradiction of those messages. He stripped everything away and claimed that a truly free life could be lived with almost nothing. The barrel, or large ceramic jar, was not just a home. It was a statement. It was a physical symbol of independence, a challenge to a society obsessed with appearances. Yet Diogenes was not a hermit. He engaged with the world constantly, often in ways designed to provoke. His public life was a performance of philosophy. Every insult, every strange action, every defiance of social norms was meant to make people stop and think. He questioned authority, mocked wisdom, and exposed hypocrisy wherever he found it. He even confronted Alexander the Great himself, refusing to be awed by power. What makes Diogenes so compelling is that his philosophy was lived, not written. He left no books, no structured system of thought, only stories, anecdotes, and the enduring image of a man who lived according to principle, no matter how strange or uncomfortable it appeared. He forces us to consider what it truly means to live honestly. He challenges us to examine our own attachments to comfort, wealth, reputation, and societal approval. As we explore Diogenes' life, we will see a man who chose freedom over convention, honesty over comfort, and truth over social acceptance. He was considered mad by some, brilliant by others, and still today, we are fascinated by him. His life is a mirror held up to human society, reflecting both our follies and our possibilities. Diogenes may have been extreme, even absurd in his actions, but his message is simple. To live freely, one must be willing to question everything, to abandon pretense, and to live in alignment with truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. In a world obsessed with wealth and status, his life asks a question that still resonates. What are you willing to give up for the sake of honesty and freedom? To understand Diogenes, we must first understand the world he rebelled against. Ancient Greece in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE was a civilization of city-states, bustling trade, and rigid social hierarchies. Athens, where Diogenes would later make his mark, was both the intellectual and cultural heart of Greece, famous for its philosophers, poets, dramatists, and democratic institutions. Yet beneath the surface of art and debate lay a society deeply concerned with wealth, status, and appearances. In Athens, social standing mattered more than personal insight. Citizens were measured by their lineage, their wealth, and their reputation. Public image was everything. People were praised or scorned not for their actions in private life, but for the way they were seen by others. A man could be admired for his wealth, even if he was corrupt or cruel, and shamed for poverty, even if he was virtuous. Society rewarded outward displays of success and punished those who deviated from social norms. Education was valued, but it was often a tool for social advancement rather than moral development. Wealthy families sent their sons to study rhetoric, philosophy, and politics to gain influence and recognition. Schools of philosophy, like those of Socrates, Plato, and the Sophists, became arenas for debate, reputation building, and intellectual competition. Philosophy was less about living rightly than about appearing wise. For Diogenes, this was the essence of corruption, a world in which people cared more about appearances than truth. Religious and civic rituals reinforced this obsession with social standing. Sacrifices, festivals, and public honors celebrated status, lineage, and wealth. Citizens were expected to participate in these rituals to maintain their reputation. Those who refused or who lived outside these norms were marginalized or ridiculed. The value system of the city placed the highest worth on prestige, comfort, and social approval, leaving little room for questioning or dissent. Meanwhile, materialism was on the rise. Athens had grown rich through trade, war, and colonization. Wealthy citizens built elaborate homes, filled with art and luxury, while the poor struggled to survive. Money was a symbol of power and virtue, often equated with moral excellence. Generosity was praised, but only when it reinforced status. Luxury was admired publicly, while simplicity was seen as weakness or eccentricity. Diogenes saw all of this as false and dangerous. In his eyes, people were enslaved by their desire for comfort and recognition. Political life also reflected these values. Athens was a democracy, but participation required time, wealth, and public visibility. Influence was reserved for those with the means to participate in civic life. Politicians were often more concerned with popularity than justice. Laws and morality were intertwined with status and power rather than principle. Diogenes would later reject politics entirely, not because he disliked law or order, but because he saw it as a system built on vanity and pretense. In this context, philosophy itself was becoming increasingly formalized. Schools like Plato's Academy were admired, but they often emphasized abstract theorizing over practical living. Philosophers debated the nature of justice, virtue, and the ideal society, but many never questioned their own attachment to wealth, comfort, and social approval. Diogenes' future confrontations with Plato and other thinkers would stem from this very tension. Theory without action was, to him, meaningless. Social norms dictated behavior from birth. Manners, clothing, diet, sexual conduct, and even posture were all regulated by expectation. Public shame was a powerful tool to enforce conformity. For most Athenians, breaking these rules was unthinkable. To reject them entirely, as Diogenes would, was revolutionary. At the same time, Athens was a city of paradoxes. It celebrated wisdom, freedom, and democracy, yet these values often coexisted with slavery, poverty, and social inequality. The pursuit of pleasure and luxury was praised, yet moderation and virtue were taught as ideals. The tension between appearance and reality was everywhere, and for Diogenes, it was a source of disgust. People claimed to value virtue, but lived in pursuit of wealth and reputation. He saw hypocrisy everywhere. The stark contrast between ideals and reality created fertile ground for a figure like Diogenes. Where most citizens sought security, comfort, and recognition, he would choose instability, deprivation, and public scrutiny. While society encouraged conformity, he embraced freedom. While people valued reputation, he valued honesty. While others hid behind rituals and appearances, he exposed life as it was. By rejecting the world of Athens, Diogenes was not rejecting humanity itself, but its illusions. He saw society as a cage built from desires, pride, and fear, and he set out to show that true freedom could only come from escaping it. His philosophy, later called cynicism, was a direct response to a society obsessed with appearances, wealth, and status. Everything he would do, living in a barrel, mocking the rich, insulting philosophers, and even challenging kings, was rooted in this rejection. To walk through Athens at the time of Diogenes was to see a city thriving in luxury and appearance, yet riddled with insecurity and pretension. It was a city where people cared more about how life looked than how it was lived. And it was precisely this world that Diogenes refused to participate in, a world he would challenge, ridicule, and ultimately transcend. By understanding the society Diogenes rejected, we we begin to see the magnitude of his choice. He did not simply live differently. He consciously opposed the values, priorities, and norms of an entire culture. Every act, from living in a jar to confronting Alexander the Great, was a statement against a world obsessed with comfort, status, and pretense. In the streets of Athens, the contrast between him and everyone else could not have been clearer, and it is this contrast that makes Diogenes both fascinating and unsettling. Diogenes was born around 412 BCE in Sinope, a prosperous Greek colony on the southern coast of the Black Sea. His family was well off, likely involved in trade, and enjoyed a respected position in society. As a young boy, Diogenes would have been exposed to the privileges of wealth, the comforts of home, and the status that came with social recognition. Yet even in these early years, hints of the man he would become are visible in the stories passed down about his intelligence, defiance, and unusual character. The most notable event of his early life was the scandal that forced him into exile. According to historical accounts, Diogenes' father, or Diogenes himself, depending on the version, was accused of debasing the city's currency. Counterfeiting or tampering with money was considered a serious crime in ancient Greece, one that could destroy trust and ruin reputations. Whether or not Diogenes participated, the accusation marked the family and brought shame, ultimately driving him from his hometown. Exile was both a punishment and a transformative experience. Losing his home, community, and social standing was devastating for any young man, especially one born into comfort. But for Diogenes, it became a turning point. Whereas many would have sought to reclaim status, wealth, or favor, he chose a radically different path: to reject society's values entirely. He left behind not only his city, but also the material comforts and social expectations that came with it. Moving to Athens, Diogenes entered a world that was both vibrant and chaotic, filled with philosophers, politicians, and merchants. He arrived as an outsider, unencumbered by the obligations of citizenship or wealth. Exile, rather than breaking him, offered freedom. It allowed him to observe society from the margins and to develop a perspective that would become central to his philosophy. He saw human behavior stripped of the protective norms of family and privilege, and he began to question the values that others took for granted. Even at this early stage, Diogenes demonstrated a sharp intelligence and a confrontational spirit. Anecdotes suggest that he often challenged others directly, refusing to accept conventional wisdom. While other young men pursued reputation, comfort, and social advancement, he seemed uninterested in approval. Where others sought security, he sought truth. Where others sought recognition, he sought freedom. This early defiance foreshadowed the radical lifestyle he would later adopt. Diogenes' move from Sinope to Athens also introduced him to a broader intellectual world. Athens was home to some of the most prominent philosophers of the era, including Socrates and his followers. Though he was young and an outsider, Diogenes' natural curiosity drew him toward these thinkers. He would eventually study under Antisthenes, a disciple of Socrates, who became a crucial influence in shaping his philosophy. Yet even in these early years, it was clear that Diogenes was not content to simply absorb teachings. He wanted to test them in practice. The psychological impact of exile cannot be overstated. Being uprooted from one's home and thrust into a new city, stripped of privilege, forces a re-evaluation of values. For Diogenes, it was a period of self-examination. He witnessed firsthand the emptiness of social status and material wealth. He saw how people clung to appearances, fearing judgment and shame. These observations reinforced his later conviction that true freedom required independence from society's expectations. Some suggest that Diogenes' rejection of social norms began as a deliberate experiment. By abandoning comfort and embracing poverty, he could demonstrate the triviality of material desires and the artificiality of social approval. Living without property, without shame, and without pretense was not merely eccentricity. It was a philosophical statement. It was a rejection of the values that had once been imposed on him and a declaration of autonomy. The exile also taught him resilience. Forced to survive in a new city with no resources, Diogenes learned to rely on himself, his wits, and the generosity of strangers. Begging for food, observing human behavior, and navigating the marketplace became part of his education in life itself. Every hardship reinforced his understanding of what was essential and what was superfluous. Material wealth, comfort, and reputation were unnecessary. Freedom, self-sufficiency, and honesty were invaluable. By the time Diogenes reached adulthood, he had transformed from a boy of privilege into a man committed to living according to principle. Exile had stripped him of society's protections and exposed him to its hypocrisies. It had given him both the insight and the courage to reject conventional life completely. In Athens, he would begin the life that history remembers, a life of radical simplicity, provocative acts, and fearless truth-telling. Diogenes' early life was marked by loss, observation, and conscious rejection. The exile from Sinope was the first step in a journey that would lead him to challenge the values of an entire civilization. It set the stage for a philosophy lived in action rather than words, a philosophy that would make him famous and infamous throughout Greece and beyond. After arriving in Athens, Diogenes was drawn to philosophy not as a study of abstract ideas, but as a way to understand life itself. It was here that he met Antisthenes, a prominent disciple of Socrates, whose teachings would profoundly shape Diogenes' worldview. Antisthenes, though less famous than Socrates, was known for advocating virtue as the only true good, insisting that moral excellence could be achieved through discipline and self-control rather than wealth or social standing. This focus on virtue and simplicity resonated deeply with Diogenes, already predisposed to question society's values. Antisthenes believed that philosophy should be practical, not theoretical. He rejected the sophist's obsession with rhetoric and persuasion, arguing instead that wisdom must manifest in daily conduct. Philosophy, in his view, was not a matter of teaching or debate, but of living rightly. Diogenes recognized in Antisthenes a model for how one might live independently of society's illusions. Yet, while Antisthenes valued simplicity, Diogenes would soon push these ideas to extreme and unconventional heights. Under Antisthenes' guidance, Diogenes studied virtue, self-discipline, and moral courage. He learned that true happiness was found not in wealth, luxury, or approval, but in living in accordance with nature and reason. Antisthenes emphasized that external goods were irrelevant. A virtuous person could endure poverty, ridicule, and hardship without suffering. For Diogenes, this was revolutionary, providing a framework that justified his rejection of social norms and comforts. The relationship between teacher and student was complex. Diogenes respected Antisthenes, but was impatient with his moderation. Where Antisthenes spoke of virtue and simplicity, Diogenes immediately sought to embody them in extreme ways. He did not theorize, he acted. While others might talk about self-discipline, Diogenes would live without clothing, sleep in a barrel, and beg in the marketplace. This radical application of philosophical principles distinguished him from his contemporaries and marked the beginning of what would later be called cynicism. Cynicism, derived from the Greek word kynikos, meaning dog-like, reflected the philosophy's emphasis on living naturally, rejecting societal conventions, and embracing self-sufficiency. The name was partly a critique from others, calling the cynics dog-like for their shameless behavior, but Diogenes embraced it. Dogs, after all, live simply, naturally, and without pretense. They are indifferent to wealth, status, and social judgment. By modeling himself on the life of a dog, Diogenes made a statement about human freedom and authenticity. One of the earliest stories of Diogenes under Antisthenes' tutelage illustrates his impatience with mere words. When Antisthenes criticized him, Diogenes responded with action rather than argument. He would eat in public, sleep outdoors, and confront those he deemed hypocritical. These behaviors were designed not for shock alone, but to demonstrate the principles he had learned. That virtue is lived, not discussed, that freedom comes from independence from desire, and that social norms are often empty distractions from truth. Diogenes' approach also reflected a broader critique of the philosophical elite. While many philosophers debated abstract ideas in the safety of their homes, Diogenes insisted on testing philosophy in the harshness of life itself. He walked the streets, challenged authority, and performed provocative acts to illustrate the discrepancy between theory and practice. In this sense, his philosophy was confrontational by design. He aimed to expose pretense wherever it existed, whether among rulers, citizens, or fellow philosophers. The influence of Antisthenes was both foundational and limited. Antisthenes gave Diogenes the tools to understand virtue and self-sufficiency, but Diogenes quickly surpassed his teacher in radicalism. Whereas Antisthenes valued discipline, Diogenes pursued freedom without compromise. He abandoned even the small comforts that Antisthenes permitted, embracing extreme poverty and public shamelessness. This divergence was key to the development of cynicism as a distinctive philosophical movement. Cynicism was not simply a rejection of wealth or comfort. It was a critique of the moral and social foundations of Greek society. By living in extreme simplicity, Diogenes revealed the arbitrary nature of social hierarchies, the emptiness of material ambition, and the tyranny of shame. He showed that human beings could live with dignity and happiness outside of the structures society imposed. His life became a constant lesson that the pursuit of virtue and truth is more important than the pursuit of wealth, fame, or approval. One famous anecdote illustrates the influence of Antisthenes while highlighting Diogenes' audacity. When asked to prove his virtue, Diogenes walked into the marketplace and began performing acts considered shameless, such as eating and relieving himself in public. To him, these acts demonstrated freedom from social illusion and dependence on the approval of others. Where Antisthenes might have spoken of virtue in measured terms, Diogenes embodied it in radical, visible ways. The mentor-student relationship also shaped Diogenes' confrontational style. Antisthenes taught critical thinking and moral courage, which Diogenes applied to challenge both individuals and society. He criticized wealth, status, and even philosophical systems that failed to align with lived virtue. His challenges were often personal, direct, and memorable, leaving a lasting impression on anyone who encountered him. In this way, Diogenes transformed the lessons of Antisthenes into a philosophy lived daily and performed publicly. By the end of this period, Diogenes had established the foundations of cynicism. He had internalized the principles of virtue, self-sufficiency, and living according to nature, but he had also amplified them to a level of extremity that would shock Athens and later generations. The meeting with Antisthenes marked the point where theory became practice and philosophy became life. Diogenes was no longer just a student or observer. He was a practitioner, a provocateur, and the beginning of a new philosophical path. Diogenes' encounter with Antisthenes provided the principles, guidance, and inspiration that shaped his early philosophy. Yet it also revealed his extraordinary independence and willingness to push ideas beyond conventional limits. Antisthenes taught him the value of virtue, but Diogenes would become the living embodiment of cynicism, shameless, fearless, and uncompromising in the pursuit of freedom and truth. It was in this crucible that the mad philosopher of Athens was born. Diogenes is most famously associated with cynicism, a philosophical movement that challenged not only materialism but also the social and moral assumptions of his time. While many associate philosophy with abstract ideas and written texts, cynicism was different. It was philosophy lived, philosophy acted, and philosophy performed in the public eye. To understand Diogenes, it is essential to grasp the core principles of cynicism, because they shaped every aspect of his life, from his choice to live in a barrel to his confrontations with kings and philosophers alike. At its heart, cynicism advocated living in accordance with nature and reason, rejecting societal conventions and embracing simplicity. The Cynics believed that true happiness did not come from wealth, status, or material possessions, but from virtue and self-sufficiency. This was a radical departure from the prevailing values of Athens, where wealth and reputation determined a person's place in society. To a cynic, chasing money, comfort, or approval was a form of slavery. Freedom could only be achieved by detaching oneself from these external dependencies. One of the central ideas of cynicism was self-sufficiency, or autarkies. A cynic sought to reduce reliance on external factors for happiness. Food, shelter, clothing, and social recognition were seen as largely irrelevant to a fulfilled life. Diogenes, for instance, lived with almost nothing, often begging for food and sleeping in public spaces. His jar, or barrel, was not just a home but a symbol of independence from societal expectations. By refusing to rely on material wealth, he demonstrated that happiness and virtue could exist without it. Closely linked to self-sufficiency was the Cynic rejection of shame and artificial social norms. Diogenes deliberately performed acts considered scandalous or obscene, such as eating, sleeping, and relieving himself in public. These acts were not impulsive or accidental. They were deliberate lessons. To Diogenes, shame was a social invention designed to control human behavior. By rejecting it, he demonstrated freedom from society's psychological chains. In his view, most people were enslaved, not by laws or rulers, but by fear of judgment, desire for approval, and attachment to convention. Another key principle was the rejection of luxury and desire. The Cynics believed that most human suffering arose from unnecessary wants. Wealth, comfort, and indulgence were distractions from virtue and truth. Diogenes, in his extreme practice, stripped life down to the essentials: food, water, and basic shelter. Every possession beyond these essentials was seen as a potential source of dependency, vanity, or corruption. For him, desire was not natural. It was learned through social conditioning, and resisting it was the path to freedom. Cynicism also emphasized living honestly and authentically. The world, according to Diogenes, was full of pretense. People pretended to be virtuous, wise, or moral, yet their actions often betrayed self-interest, vanity, or cowardice. By living openly and shamelessly, the Cynic exposed hypocrisy in society. Every public act, every insult, and every confrontation was a test. It revealed the difference between appearance and reality. Diogenes' famous walk with a lantern in daylight, searching for an honest man, encapsulates this pursuit. He sought truth in a world dominated by deception. Importantly, cynicism was not merely about rejecting society. It was about affirming virtue as the ultimate good. Diogenes believed that living virtuously, acting honestly, courageously, and rationally, was the only path to genuine happiness. Everything else, including wealth, reputation, or power, was secondary or irrelevant. This moral focus separated the Cynics from hedonists, sophists, or materialists, who equated happiness with pleasure, influence, or material gain. For Diogenes, external rewards could never replace the internal satisfaction of living rightly. The Cynic philosophy also included an element of provocation and pedagogy. Diogenes deliberately shocked people to make them question their assumptions. By mocking wealth, confronting authority, and exposing hypocrisy, he turned everyday life into a lesson in ethics. Philosophy, in this sense, was not abstract discussion but active demonstration. Each act, from begging in the marketplace to insulting Plato or Alexander the Great, was designed to reveal truths about human nature and society. While Diogenes' practices were extreme, they were rooted in logical consistency. If wealth, status, and social approval are not necessary for happiness, then why cling to them? If shame is a social construct, then why be embarrassed? If desires are imposed by society, then why allow them to control life? His radical lifestyle was the logical conclusion of these principles, and it forced observers to confront the contradictions in their own lives. Cynicism also intersected with other philosophical schools, particularly Stoicism, which emerged later. The Stoics adopted the ideas of self-sufficiency, virtue, and freedom from external dependency, but often in a less extreme, more socially palatable form. While the Stoics valued reason and inner tranquility, Diogenes emphasized living virtuously in public, regardless of how society judged you. In this sense, he can be seen as a bridge between theory and action, taking philosophical ideas to their most uncompromising conclusion. A modern perspective highlights parallels between cynicism and movements like minimalism or anti-consumerism. The idea that happiness does not come from material accumulation, that freedom involves reducing dependency on society's approval, and that living authentically is more valuable than social conformity, all echo in contemporary debates about lifestyle, purpose, and personal fulfillment. Yet Diogenes' approach remains startlingly radical. He lived his philosophy openly, provocatively, and with complete disregard for social approval. The Cynic philosophy explained simply consists of several interconnected principles. Live according to nature, reject unnecessary desires, embrace simplicity, be self-sufficient, reject shame, pursue virtue, and act honestly. Diogenes embodied all of these principles in extreme form, demonstrating that philosophy was not just a matter of thought but of daily action. Through his life, he challenged everyone around him to reconsider the true sources of happiness, freedom, and virtue. In the streets of Athens, in his public confrontations and personal austerity, Diogenes made abstract philosophical principles tangible. He transformed ideas into lived experience, turning morality into a spectacle and freedom into a way of life. The Cynic philosophy, in essence, asks a single question of every observer. What would you be willing to give up to live truthfully, freely, and virtuously? For Diogenes, the answer was simple: everything. One of the most enduring images of Diogenes is that of a man living in a large ceramic jar, often described as a barrel, in the heart of Athens. This image has survived for centuries because it captures the essence of his philosophy in a single scene. Diogenes did not retreat from society. He lived in the middle of it, stripped of comfort, privacy, and possessions, making his life a public challenge to the values of the world around him. The jar was not a symbol of poverty forced upon him. It was a deliberate choice. In ancient Athens, such large storage jars were commonly used to hold grain, wine, or oil. By living in one, Diogenes reduced shelter to its most basic form. He needed protection from the weather, not status or comfort. The jar served that purpose. Nothing more was required. In this way, his home became a philosophical argument. It proved that the human body needs far less than society claims. Diogenes believed that ownership created dependence. Houses tied people to money, labor, and anxiety. Property encouraged fear of loss and desire for more. By rejecting private property, he freed himself from these burdens. The jar allowed him to move, observe, and live without attachment. It was not a retreat from life, but a rejection of unnecessary complexity. Begging was another central feature of Diogenes' public life. In Greek society, begging was associated with failure, weakness, and shame. Diogenes reversed this meaning. He begged openly, without apology, and without humiliation. To him, begging was a practice in humility and freedom. It trained him to need less, expect less, and remain independent of pride. He often begged from statues, fully aware that they could give him nothing. When questioned about this strange behavior, he explained that it helped him practice rejection. By asking from those who could not respond, he trained himself to accept denial calmly. This was not a joke. It was discipline. Diogenes believed that emotional dependence on others was just another form of slavery. Begging without expectation removed that dependence. The marketplace became his home and his classroom. Unlike other philosophers who taught in schools or private gatherings, Diogenes lived where people worked, argued, traded, and gathered. He ate there, slept there, and spoke there. Philosophy, in his view, belonged in the open, not behind walls. The city itself was the stage, and every passerby was a potential student. His public presence was intentional. Diogenes wanted his life to be seen. He believed that private virtue was not enough. If philosophy was true, it should survive exposure, criticism, and ridicule. Living publicly forced him to remain consistent. There was no private self and public self. There was only action. Many Athenians found him offensive. He disrupted social order simply by existing outside of it. He refused to follow customs regarding clothing, manners, or behavior. He ate when hungry, slept when tired, and spoke when moved to speak. By ignoring social timing and rules, he exposed how artificial they were. He lived according to physical need, not social expectation. Diogenes often compared human life unfavorably to animals. Dogs, he argued, lived naturally. They ate without shame, slept wherever they could, and showed loyalty without pretense. Humans, by contrast, complicated their lives with unnecessary desires, rules, and fears. This is why he accepted the label dog-like, and even embraced it. To live like a dog was, in his view, to live honestly. The public nature of his life also allowed him to confront people directly. He challenged wealthy citizens about their greed, mocked philosophers for their empty theories, and criticized leaders for their hypocrisy. These confrontations were not random insults. They were aimed at exposing contradiction. A man who preached virtue while chasing wealth was, to Diogenes, a fraud. Despite his harsh manner, Diogenes was not motivated by cruelty. His goal was clarity. He believed that polite behavior often hid dishonesty. By stripping away politeness, he forced people to face uncomfortable truths. His bluntness shocked people into awareness, even if it offended them. Living without possessions also gave him a rare form of freedom. He could not be threatened with loss. He could not be bribed. He owed nothing to anyone. This independence allowed him to speak honestly to people of every rank. Kings, politicians, and scholars received no special treatment. To Diogenes, all humans were equal in their capacity for virtue and folly. His public life blurred the line between philosophy and performance. Some saw him as a clown. Others saw him as a prophet. Diogenes did not care which. His concern was not reputation but truth. If ridicule helped expose false values, then ridicule was useful. If shock helped wake people from complacency, then shock was justified. Importantly, Diogenes did not ask others to imitate his lifestyle completely. His goal was not to create followers who lived in jars. His goal was to reveal how unnecessary most social conventions were. By living at the extreme, he made moderation visible. His life was a mirror held up to society, showing how much of it was built on fear, habit, and desire rather than necessity. The barrel, the begging, and the public life were all expressions of the same principle: freedom through simplicity. By removing everything non-essential, Diogenes claimed control over his own life. He answered to no employer, no ruler, and no social code. His life was his argument. In the crowded streets of Athens, surrounded by ambition, wealth, and competition, Diogenes stood as a contradiction. He owned nothing, yet claimed to be richer than kings. He lived without comfort, yet spoke of happiness. He had no status, yet feared no authority. His public life was not a rejection of humanity, but a challenge to it. Through his extreme simplicity, Diogenes asked a question that remains uncomfortable even today. How much of what we call necessity is actually habit, and how much of our suffering comes not from need, but from desire? By living openly with almost nothing, he forced society to confront the possibility that freedom and contentment might require far less than it assumes. Few aspects of Diogenes' life disturbed ancient society more than his complete rejection of shame. While poverty and simplicity could be admired from a distance, shamelessness struck at the heart of social order. Shame was one of the strongest tools used to control behavior in Greek society. Diogenes understood this, and he deliberately dismantled it. What others saw as indecency, he treated as a philosophical weapon. In Athens, shame governed daily life. People dressed, spoke, and behaved in ways designed to avoid public embarrassment. Social rules dictated when one could eat, where one could sleep, and how one should act in public. Breaking these rules invited ridicule and exclusion. Diogenes believed these rules were not based on nature or reason, but on habit and fear. By violating them openly, he exposed their fragility. Diogenes ate in the marketplace, a place where eating was considered improper. When criticized, he replied that if it was not shameful to eat at home, it could not be shameful to eat anywhere. Hunger did not change with location. This simple logic revealed the arbitrary nature of social rules. Many of his actions followed this pattern. He asked why certain natural behaviors became disgraceful only when witnessed. He went further by performing acts that society considered deeply inappropriate. These stories, though often exaggerated, illustrate his core message. Diogenes believed that if something was natural and necessary, it should not be hidden or denied. To him, modesty was not a virtue but a mask. It forced people to lie about their bodies and desires. This rejection of shame was not impulsive. It was carefully reasoned. Diogenes saw shame as a tool that kept people obedient. Fear of embarrassment discouraged honesty and independence. People stayed in unhappy jobs, false relationships, and empty traditions because they feared public judgment. By eliminating shame from his own life, Diogenes removed one of society's strongest levers of control. His behavior made people uncomfortable because it confronted them with their own contradictions. They believed themselves rational and virtuous, yet they were disturbed by a man simply acting according to bodily needs. Diogenes used this discomfort to reveal hypocrisy. If virtue was truly valued, why was it overshadowed by concern for appearances? Shamelessness also allowed Diogenes to speak freely. He insulted wealthy citizens, mocked scholars, and criticized rulers without hesitation. Most people filtered their speech to protect their reputation or safety. Diogenes had nothing to protect. Without shame or fear of social loss, he could confront anyone. This freedom made him dangerous and, paradoxically, respected. His insults were not random cruelty. They were precise and often targeted at false authority. He mocked philosophers who spoke of virtue while living in luxury. He criticized leaders who demanded obedience while serving their own interests. By stripping away politeness, he exposed truth. Politeness, in his view, often served as a cover for dishonesty. Diogenes believed that shame distorted moral judgment. People judged actions not by whether they were good or harmful, but by whether they were socially acceptable. This led to a society where injustice could be ignored if it followed tradition, while honesty could be condemned if it broke convention. Shamelessness reversed this logic. It forced moral evaluation based on substance rather than form. The reactions to Diogenes reveal how powerful shame truly is. Some laughed at him. Some were offended. Others admired his courage, but could not imitate it. Very few were indifferent. His presence disrupted the social environment. By refusing to participate in shared illusions, he reminded others that those illusions were choices, not necessities. Importantly, Diogenes did not argue that everyone should abandon all modesty or behave exactly as he did. His extremity was intentional. By pushing boundaries to their limit, he made those boundaries visible. Most people never question social rules because they are never challenged. Diogenes challenged them publicly, repeatedly, and without apology. Shamelessness also protected him psychologically. Insults, mockery, and rejection had no power over him because he accepted them in advance. This made him emotionally resilient. Where others were vulnerable to praise and blame, Diogenes remained stable. His self-worth did not depend on reputation. It depended on living truthfully. There is a deeper lesson here. Shame often prevents people from examining their lives honestly. It encourages conformity rather than reflection. Diogenes' shamelessness was a demand for authenticity. He forced people to ask whether their choices were guided by reason or by fear of judgment. Modern audiences often misunderstand this aspect of his philosophy. It is easy to dismiss his behavior as vulgar or attention-seeking. But within his framework, shamelessness was not about shock for its own sake. It was about freedom. Freedom from fear. Freedom from hypocrisy. Freedom from the constant pressure to perform a socially acceptable identity. In a society built on appearances, shamelessness was revolutionary. It challenged the idea that dignity comes from conformity. Diogenes argued instead that dignity comes from honesty and independence. A person who lives according to truth, even if mocked, is freer than one who lives comfortably while pretending. This is why shamelessness was his most powerful weapon. It disarmed social pressure. It exposed false values. It granted him total freedom of speech and action. By refusing to be embarrassed, Diogenes refused to be controlled. Through shamelessness, Diogenes did not reject morality. He rejected false morality. He rejected rules that served no purpose except to maintain social order and protect vanity. His life suggested a radical idea, that a person unburdened by shame is capable of living more honestly, more freely, and more courageously than one bound by fear of judgment. Diogenes' shamelessness was not an absence of values, but a commitment to deeper ones. It demanded courage, consistency, and a willingness to stand alone. It remains one of the most unsettling and challenging aspects of his philosophy, because it forces us to confront how much of our behavior is shaped not by truth, but by fear. The conflict between Diogenes and Plato represents one of the most striking clashes in the history of philosophy. It was not simply a disagreement between two thinkers, but a collision between two radically different ways of understanding truth. Plato represented philosophy as theory, structure, and abstraction. Diogenes represented philosophy as action, experience, and lived reality. Their encounters reveal a deeper question. Is wisdom found in ideas, or in the way one lives? Plato was one of the most respected philosophers in Athens. A student of Socrates, he founded the academy and developed complex theories about reality, knowledge, and ethics. He believed that true reality existed beyond the physical world, in perfect and unchanging forms. According to Plato, what we see around us are imperfect copies of these ideal forms. To know the truth, one must rise above everyday experience and grasp these higher realities through reason. Diogenes rejected this approach entirely. To him, philosophy that ignored daily life was useless. He believed that truth should be visible, tangible, and tested through action. While Plato discussed ideals, Diogenes lived in poverty. While Plato taught students behind walls, Diogenes challenged people in the streets. He saw Plato's philosophy as detached from real human needs and weaknesses. Their disagreements were often expressed through sharp humor and public insult. One famous story captures this tension perfectly. Plato once defined a human being as a featherless biped. Diogenes responded by plucking a chicken and bringing it into Plato's school, declaring, "Here is Plato's man." The story is humorous, but its meaning is serious. Diogenes was criticizing philosophy that relied on clever definitions rather than real understanding. To him, wisdom should not collapse under a simple challenge. This episode illustrates how Diogenes treated philosophy as combat. He believed ideas should be tested aggressively. If a concept could not survive ridicule or practical application, it was flawed. Plato sought clarity through refinement of concepts. Diogenes sought clarity through exposure and confrontation. Where Plato aimed for precision, Diogenes aimed for honesty. Diogenes often accused Plato and other philosophers of intellectual vanity. He believed that abstract thinking allowed people to appear wise without living virtuously. One could speak beautifully about justice while benefiting from injustice. One could praise moderation while enjoying luxury. Diogenes saw this as hypocrisy, and he refused to participate in it. Plato, in turn, likely saw Diogenes as crude and disruptive. Plato believed that order, structure, and education were essential for a just society. Diogenes rejected social structure almost entirely. He did not believe that laws or institutions made people virtuous. He believed virtue came from personal discipline and freedom from desire. This fundamental disagreement made reconciliation impossible. Their conflict also reflected two visions of human improvement. Plato believed people could be shaped through education and proper institutions. His ideal society was carefully organized, with defined roles and moral training. Diogenes believed that institutions corrupted people. The more complex society became, the further it drifted from nature. Improvement, in his view, came from simplification, not organization. Diogenes' mockery was not meant to destroy philosophy itself, but to purify it. He believed that philosophy had become too comfortable, too distant from real suffering and struggle. By confronting Plato publicly, he forced philosophical ideas out of protected spaces and into the open. His presence reminded thinkers that wisdom must withstand the chaos of real life. There is also a difference in how each viewed human desire. Plato saw desire as something to be controlled through reason and structure. Diogenes saw desire as something to be reduced through discipline and simplicity. Plato trusted reason to guide desire. Diogenes trusted hardship to eliminate it. Both sought freedoms, but through very different paths. The tension between them highlights a question that still matters today. Is understanding enough, or must understanding be lived? Can someone be wise without being free from greed, fear, and vanity? Diogenes answered no. Plato was more optimistic. He believed that understanding could guide behavior. Diogenes believed behavior revealed understanding. Despite his criticism, Diogenes did not deny Plato's intelligence. His insults were aimed at what he saw as misdirected effort. He believed that endless theorizing distracted people from the urgent task of living well. Every hour spent debating definitions was an hour not spent confronting desire, fear, or hypocrisy. Their rivalry also shaped how philosophy developed after them. Plato's influence dominated formal education and written philosophy. Diogenes' influence survived through stories, examples, and lived tradition. One became the foundation of academic philosophy. The other became a challenge to it. Interestingly, later philosophers often tried to combine these approaches. Stoicism, for example, adopted abstract reasoning while emphasizing practical ethics and self-discipline. In this sense, the tension between Diogenes and Plato did not end with them. It became a permanent feature of philosophical debate. Diogenes' confrontations with Plato remind us that philosophy is not only about ideas, but about values. Plato valued order, clarity, and intellectual structure. Diogenes valued freedom, honesty, and independence. Neither was merely wrong. But Diogenes forced a question Plato could not avoid. What is the value of wisdom if it does not change how one lives? In the streets of Athens, their conflict played out not through formal debate, but through action and ridicule. Diogenes' presence challenged philosophers to look beyond words. His life asked whether philosophy existed to explain the world, or to free people from it. The clash between Diogenes and Plato reveals two enduring paths. One seeks truth through theory and structure. The other seeks truth through experience and rejection of illusion. Diogenes chose combat over comfort, confrontation over consensus. His fight with Plato was not personal. It was philosophical. And it remains relevant because it reflects a tension that still shapes how we think about wisdom today. One of the most famous images associated with Diogenes is that of him walking through Athens in broad daylight, holding a lit lantern. When asked what he was doing, he replied, "I am looking for an honest man." The scene is simple, almost absurd, yet it captures the core of his philosophy. This act was not a joke, nor was it meant to entertain. It was a public accusation against society itself. Diogenes believed that dishonesty was woven into everyday life. People lied not only to others, but to themselves. They claimed to value virtue, justice, and wisdom, yet their actions were guided by fear, desire, and ambition. The lantern was a symbol of exposure. In full daylight, light was unnecessary. That was the point. The problem was not darkness, but blindness. By walking openly with the lantern, Diogenes challenged the assumption that truth was obvious. If truth were easy to see, society would not be filled with hypocrisy. The lantern suggested that honesty was so rare it required special effort to find. This was not a condemnation of individuals alone, but of a system that rewarded deception and punished sincerity. To Diogenes, honesty was not about telling the truth in speech alone. It was about alignment between belief and action. A man who spoke of virtue but lived in luxury was not honest. A politician who promised justice but pursued power was not honest. Even philosophers who praised simplicity while enjoying comfort failed his test. Honesty, in his view, required courage, consistency, and sacrifice. The lantern episode also revealed Diogenes' belief that self-deception was the most common form of dishonesty. People convinced themselves that their choices were reasonable, necessary, or moral, even when driven by fear or greed. Social norms made this easier. When everyone behaves in the same way, no one feels responsible for questioning it. Diogenes used the lantern to break this collective illusion. Walking through the marketplace, he forced people to confront his message. Some laughed. Others were offended. A few may have reflected. Diogenes did not expect universal agreement. His goal was disruption. He wanted to disturb complacency and expose how rare moral courage truly was. The lantern also represented Diogenes' rejection of moral relativism. He believed that virtue was objective and visible in behavior. A person either lived honestly or did not. Excuses, explanations, and social approval did not change that. By holding the lantern, he placed himself in the role of judge, not through authority, but through example. This act was especially provocative in a society that valued reputation. Athens was full of respected citizens, honored officials, and celebrated thinkers. Diogenes' search implied that none of them met his standard. It was a direct challenge to social hierarchy. Wealth, education, and status meant nothing if they were not matched by integrity. The lantern story also reveals Diogenes' understanding of loneliness. To live honestly in a dishonest society is isolating. Few are willing to accept the cost of truth. Diogenes embraced this isolation. He did not seek followers or validation. His search was not desperate. It was diagnostic. He already suspected the outcome. There is also an element of hope in the story. The search itself implies that honesty is possible, even if rare. Diogenes did not say honest people did not exist. He said they were hard to find. This distinction matters. His philosophy was not cynical in the modern sense of despair. It was demanding. It asked more of people than they were willing to give. The lantern continues to resonate because it reflects a timeless problem. Societies reward performance over integrity. People curate images, hide flaws, and present acceptable versions of themselves. Diogenes' act strips away this performance. It asks a simple question: are you living the life you claim to value? In modern terms, the lantern could be seen as a search for authenticity. Diogenes did not care about popularity or approval. He cared about alignment between words and actions. This standard remains uncomfortable because it cannot be satisfied through appearance alone. The simplicity of the lantern story is what gives it power. No speech, no lecture, just a man walking with a light that should not be needed. It forces observers to supply the meaning themselves. That meaning is difficult to escape. Diogenes' lantern was not a symbol of superiority. It was a symbol of urgency. He believed that a life built on dishonesty, even comfortable dishonesty, was wasted. Honesty, even when painful, was the foundation of freedom. The lantern episode summarizes Diogenes' role in society. He was not there to comfort, instruct, or persuade gently. He was there to reveal. His search for an honest man was a mirror held up to the city, asking each person silently whether they were willing to live without illusion. One of the most famous encounters in ancient history is the meeting between Diogenes and Alexander the Great. The story has been retold for centuries because it captures a moment where absolute power meets absolute independence. On one side stood Alexander, the most powerful man in the known world. On the other stood Diogenes, a man who owned nothing, feared nothing, and wanted nothing from anyone. Alexander visited Corinth while consolidating his power over Greece. He was young, ambitious, and already legendary. Kings, generals, and politicians sought his favor. When Alexander heard about Diogenes, he was intrigued. Here was a man who openly mocked wealth, authority, and ambition. Unlike others, Diogenes did not seek Alexander out. Alexander went to him. Diogenes was lying in the sun when Alexander approached, surrounded by guards and attendants. The scene itself was symbolic. Power arrived in armor and ceremony. Freedom lay stretched out, exposed and unconcerned. Alexander addressed Diogenes respectfully and offered to grant him any wish. It was an offer few people in history could refuse. Diogenes' response was simple: "Stand out of my sunlight." This reply shocked everyone present. It was not insulting in tone, yet it was deeply subversive. Diogenes did not ask for money, protection, or influence. He did not even acknowledge Alexander's authority. The only thing Alexander had done was block the sun. By asking him to move, Diogenes reduced the world's greatest ruler to an inconvenience. The power of this moment lies in what it revealed. Alexander could conquer cities, command armies, and shape empires. But he could not offer Diogenes anything of value. Diogenes already possessed what Alexander could not give: freedom from desire. According to tradition, Alexander later remarked, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." Whether or not he truly said this, the sentiment reflects a real tension. Alexander ruled the world but was bound by ambition, fear of loss, and the demands of power. Diogenes ruled himself. In that sense, Diogenes was freer than any king. This encounter highlights Diogenes' view of power. He believed that power over others was meaningless without power over oneself. A man enslaved by desire, even if crowned, was still a slave. A man free of desire, even if poor, was sovereign. Diogenes did not reject authority out of bitterness or resentment. He simply did not recognize its value. Titles, ranks, and commands only mattered to those who feared punishment or desired reward. Diogenes desired neither. This made him immune to intimidation and bribery. The meeting also exposed the fragility of political power. Alexander's authority depended on loyalty, fear, and recognition. Diogenes acknowledged none of these. Without acknowledgement, power loses its grip. Diogenes demonstrated that the most effective way to resist domination is to want nothing from the dominator. This was not an argument against leadership or order. It was an argument against confusing power with worth. Diogenes believed that admiration for power often masked insecurity. People bowed not because rulers were wise, but because they were afraid. Diogenes had removed fear from his life, and with it, the influence of power. The encounter also reveals something about Alexander. Despite his dominance, he sought validation. He wanted to impress Diogenes, or at least be acknowledged by him. This suggests that even the most powerful individuals crave recognition. Diogenes' indifference was unsettling because it could not be controlled. Diogenes' response was not a rejection of generosity, but a rejection of dependency. Accepting a gift from Alexander would have placed him in a relationship of obligation. Diogenes refused that relationship. Freedom, in his philosophy, required independence not only from material goods, but from social ties that compromised honesty. This story endured because it dramatized a philosophical truth in a single exchange. It showed that power is relational. It only exists where people participate in it. By refusing participation, Diogenes stepped outside its reach. The meeting also reinforced Diogenes' belief that happiness does not come from expanding control, but from reducing need. Alexander conquered the world, but was never satisfied. Diogenes possessed almost nothing and claimed contentment. Their meeting asked a silent question: who was truly successful? In later traditions, this encounter became a moral lesson. Kings were reminded that authority does not guarantee wisdom. Philosophers were reminded that freedom requires courage. Diogenes stood as proof that a life of simplicity could rival, and even surpass, a life of power in dignity. The scene of Diogenes lying in the sun remains powerful because it reverses expectations. The king becomes a visitor. The beggar becomes the judge. Wealth becomes irrelevant. Freedom becomes visible. Diogenes did not defeat Alexander. He did not need to. He revealed the limits of power by refusing to value it. His calm indifference exposed a truth that still unsettles societies today: that the strongest form of resistance is not rebellion, but independence. One of the most striking episodes in Diogenes' life is his capture by pirates and subsequent sale into slavery. For most people, slavery represented the ultimate loss of freedom. For Diogenes, it became another test of his philosophy. Rather than contradicting his beliefs, the experience reinforced them and revealed how deeply he understood the nature of freedom. According to ancient accounts, Diogenes was captured during a sea journey and sold at a slave market. When asked what skills he possessed, he replied, "I can rule men." This response was not arrogance. It was confidence rooted in self-mastery. Diogenes believed that anyone who could govern their own desires, fears, and impulses was fit to lead others. He was eventually purchased by a wealthy Corinthian named Xeniades, who put him in charge of educating his children. In this role, Diogenes did not behave like a typical slave. He spoke freely, criticized openly, and lived according to his principles. He accepted his legal status without internal submission. This distinction mattered. His body was owned, but his mind was not. Diogenes made a clear separation between external conditions and internal freedom. Slavery, to him, was a legal category, not a moral one. A person enslaved by fear, desire, or ambition was less free than a person in chains who lived without illusion. This idea challenged one of society's deepest assumptions, that freedom is determined by status rather than character. His response to enslavement shocked those around him. He did not beg for pity or rage against fate. He adapted. He continued to live simply, speak honestly, and challenge hypocrisy. In doing so, he demonstrated that freedom was not something granted by law, but something cultivated through discipline. Diogenes often pointed out that many free citizens lived more constrained lives than slaves. They feared public opinion, chased wealth, and obeyed social expectations. These fears dictated their actions. Diogenes, even in bondage, refused such submission. He accepted physical limitation but rejected psychological captivity. This episode also highlights the consistency of his philosophy. Diogenes did not modify his beliefs when circumstances changed. His teachings were not dependent on comfort or autonomy. They were designed for adversity. Slavery did not invalidate his philosophy. It proved its strength. There is an important lesson here about resilience. Diogenes did not define himself by his circumstances. He defined himself by how he responded to them. This approach removed the power of misfortune. Events could affect his body, but not his values. As a teacher, Diogenes focused on developing character rather than knowledge. He trained children to endure hardship, speak truthfully, and live simply. He believed that education should prepare individuals for life, not status. This contrasted sharply with traditional education, which aimed at social success and reputation. His presence in the household of Xeniades also blurred the line between master and slave. While legally owned, Diogenes often spoke with authority and independence. Those around him recognized his wisdom and moral strength. In practice, he was more free than many who commanded him. This reversal of roles reinforced one of Diogenes' central claims, that freedom and authority are not the same. Authority depends on force and recognition. Freedom depends on self-control and clarity. A person may possess one without the other. The story of Diogenes in slavery unsettles because it challenges comfortable definitions. It suggests that freedom is not guaranteed by rights alone. It must be practiced internally. This does not diminish the cruelty of slavery, but it reframes the concept of freedom itself. Diogenes never romanticized suffering. He did not seek slavery. But when it came, he treated it as another condition of life to be faced honestly. He did not dramatize his situation or use it as a moral badge. He simply continued to live as he always had. This attitude made him difficult to dominate. Control relies on fear and desire. Diogenes offered neither. He accepted what he could not change and refused to surrender what mattered. In this way, he embodied a form of freedom that could not be taken. Diogenes' experience with slavery reinforced his most radical claim, that true freedom is internal. Wealth, citizenship, and power may change, but self-mastery remains. His life demonstrated that the strongest chains are not made of iron, but of fear and desire. This idea would later influence Stoic thinkers, who echoed his belief that freedom comes from mastery of the self rather than control over circumstances. Diogenes did not write these ideas down. He lived them, even in chains. Diogenes was not a gentle teacher. He did not persuade through careful argument or polite debate. Instead, he used humor, insult, and ridicule as tools to break illusions. His words often stung, but they were meant to wake people up. This approach can be described as philosophical violence, not physical harm, but an attack on false beliefs, vanity, and complacency. Humor was central to Diogenes' method. He understood that laughter could disarm defenses more effectively than reasoned argument. When people laughed, they momentarily dropped their pride. In that moment, truth could enter. Diogenes used jokes, absurd actions, and sharp remarks to reveal contradictions that polite discussion often ignored. His insults were rarely random. They targeted hypocrisy. When philosophers spoke about virtue while living in luxury, Diogenes mocked them. When leaders demanded obedience while acting selfishly, he exposed them. His language was blunt because he believed soft words allowed falsehood to survive. Politeness, in his view, often protected dishonesty. Diogenes believed that society trained people to avoid discomfort at all costs. This made them fragile. By confronting people harshly, he forced them to face discomfort directly. The shock of insult served as a test. If a belief could not survive criticism, it was not worth holding. Many stories describe Diogenes insulting respected figures in public. These moments were shocking not because of the words alone, but because of the social risk involved. Insulting powerful people invited punishment. Diogenes accepted that risk. His willingness to speak without fear exposed the silence of others. This approach made him unpopular with elites, but memorable to everyone. People might forget a lecture, but they remembered being challenged or embarrassed. Diogenes understood that emotional impact mattered. His goal was not approval but transformation. The violence in his method lay in its directness. He did not allow people to hide behind status, education, or reputation. Everyone was treated equally. Kings and beggars received the same honesty. This equality was unsettling because it removed social protection. Diogenes also used humor to undermine authority. Authority relies on seriousness and distance. By laughing at power, he reduced it. A ruler who can be mocked loses part of their hold. Diogenes' jokes were not trivial. They were acts of resistance. Importantly, Diogenes did not see himself as cruel. He believed he was being kind in the most honest way. Allowing people to live in self-deception, in his view, was the real cruelty. His insults were meant to strip away illusions, not to humiliate for pleasure. There is a difference between mockery that degrades and mockery that clarifies. Diogenes aimed for the latter. He mocked behavior, not humanity itself. His harshness was directed at false values, not at the human capacity for virtue. His style also reflected his rejection of hierarchy. In polite society, speech changes depending on status. Diogenes refused this. He spoke the same way to everyone. This consistency reinforced his philosophy of equality and independence. Many misunderstood him. Some dismissed him as a fool. Others called him mad. Diogenes accepted these labels because they did not affect his purpose. Being misunderstood was a price he willingly paid for honesty. The lasting power of his humor lies in its clarity. Even centuries later, his stories remain vivid. The plucked chicken, the lantern, the insult to Alexander. All are remembered because they compress complex ideas into simple actions. Diogenes knew that a well-placed joke could carry more truth than a long argument. This method influenced later philosophical traditions, particularly satire and social criticism. The idea that humor can reveal truth runs through history, from ancient writers to modern comedians. Diogenes stands at the origin of this tradition. His use of insult and humor also reveals his confidence. Only someone secure in their values can risk being disliked. Diogenes did not need approval because he did not depend on others for his identity. This independence gave his words force. In the end, Diogenes' philosophical violence was a form of care. He believed that truth mattered more than comfort. His humor cut through pretense, his insults pierced pride, and his presence disrupted false peace. He did not aim to destroy people, but to destroy the lies they lived by. That is why his voice still echoes. In a world that often prefers politeness over honesty, Diogenes reminds us that clarity sometimes requires sharpness. His laughter was not light-hearted. It was deliberate, precise, and aimed directly at the illusions that keep people from living freely. Diogenes has often been described as mad, insane, or unbalanced. Ancient writers sometimes portrayed him as a lunatic, and modern readers often ask the same question. A man who lived in a jar, mocked powerful leaders, insulted respected philosophers, and rejected social norms can easily appear unstable. But the question deserves careful examination. Was Diogenes mentally unwell, or was he deliberately radical? To answer this, it is important to separate social conformity from mental stability. Diogenes violated almost every expectation of his culture. He rejected wealth, ignored etiquette, lived in public, and spoke without restraint. In any society, such behavior invites suspicion. People often label what they do not understand as madness. However, Diogenes' actions were consistent, purposeful, and coherent. Mental instability typically shows confusion, unpredictability, or loss of control. Diogenes showed none of these. His behavior followed a clear philosophy. He acted in ways that reinforced his beliefs about simplicity, honesty, and freedom. Diogenes did not drift randomly through life. He made deliberate choices. Living in a jar was not a symptom of delusion. It was a rejection of unnecessary comfort. Mocking authority was not impulsive rage. It was a critique of power. His insults were sharp, relevant, and targeted. This level of precision suggests clarity rather than disorder. Ancient critics often confused discomfort with pathology. Diogenes made people uncomfortable because he exposed contradictions in their lives. It was easier to dismiss him as mad than to confront his message. Labeling dissenters as unstable is a common social defense mechanism. There is also the question of self-awareness. Diogenes understood how others saw him. He sometimes leaned into the image of the madman because it gave him freedom. By rejecting respectability, he freed himself from its constraints. This was strategy, not illness. His philosophy required emotional control. Diogenes endured hunger, cold, and social rejection without complaint. He accepted ridicule and punishment calmly. These traits are inconsistent with mental instability. They suggest discipline and resilience. Diogenes also maintained strong reasoning abilities. He debated philosophers, responded quickly to challenges, and exposed logical flaws in others' arguments. His thinking was sharp and responsive. He was not disconnected from reality. He engaged with it directly. The accusation of madness often comes from modern assumptions about normal life. Today, refusing stable housing, steady income, and social approval is seen as failure or disorder. Diogenes rejected these not because he could not achieve them, but because he did not value them. He believed they distracted from virtue. It is also worth noting that Diogenes influenced major philosophical traditions. His ideas shaped cynicism and influenced Stoicism. Thinkers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius echoed his emphasis on self-control and independence. It is unlikely that such influence would come from incoherent thought. That said, Diogenes was extreme. He pushed his philosophy to limits that most people would not tolerate. Extremity, however, is not the same as instability. It is a choice about values. Diogenes valued truth and freedom above comfort and acceptance. Some argue that Diogenes lacked empathy or social awareness. Yet many stories show concern for human weakness. His criticism aimed at false values, not human suffering. He believed people harmed themselves through ambition and greed. His harshness came from frustration, not indifference. Modern psychology would likely resist diagnosing Diogenes based on anecdote. More importantly, diagnosis misses the point. The real question is not whether Diogenes fit a category, but whether his life was coherent and intentional. By that measure, it was. Diogenes challenged the assumption that a good life must look respectable. He lived in a way that made his values visible. This visibility made him vulnerable to ridicule. He accepted that risk. In the end, calling Diogenes mad says more about society than about him. He refused to play roles that others depended on. He refused to measure success by wealth or approval. That refusal looked like madness to those invested in the system. Diogenes was not unstable. He was uncompromising. He lived according to principles that most people admire in theory but avoid in practice. His life forces an uncomfortable question. If rejecting lies looks like madness, what does that say about normality? Diogenes did not leave behind written works. He did not build a school or formal system. Yet his influence on later philosophy was deep and lasting. His ideas shaped the Cynic tradition and strongly influenced Stoicism, one of the most enduring philosophical movements in Western history. His impact came not from texts, but from example. The Cynic movement began with Antisthenes, a student of Socrates, but Diogenes gave it its most radical form. He stripped philosophy down to lived practice. For Diogenes, philosophy was not something discussed in classrooms. It was something performed in public, through daily choices. This shift changed how philosophy could function. Stoicism inherited many of Diogenes' core ideas, even as it softened their presentation. Stoics adopted the belief that virtue is the only true good and that external things like wealth, status, and health are ultimately indifferent. These ideas echo Diogenes' rejection of material attachment. Epictetus, one of the most important Stoic thinkers, openly admired Diogenes. He described him as a model of freedom and moral courage. Epictetus saw Diogenes as someone who lived in harmony with nature and reason, even without comfort or protection. This admiration shows how seriously later philosophers took Diogenes' example. Stoicism also adopted the idea that freedom comes from self-control rather than circumstance. This belief runs directly through Diogenes' life. His experience with poverty, ridicule, and slavery demonstrated that external conditions do not determine inner freedom. Stoics later formalized this insight into ethical teachings. Where Stoicism differed was in tone and method. Stoics valued social duty and self-discipline within society. Diogenes rejected social roles entirely. He acted as a provocateur rather than a guide. Stoicism translated his radical independence into a philosophy that could function within political and social life. Diogenes also influenced the Stoic concept of cosmopolitanism. He famously declared himself a citizen of the world. This challenged the idea that identity should be tied to city, class, or nation. Stoics later expanded this into the belief that all humans belong to a shared moral community. Beyond Stoicism, Diogenes influenced traditions of satire, social criticism, and moral protest. His method of using humor to expose hypocrisy appears in later writers who used wit to challenge authority. His example showed that philosophy could confront power directly. Christian thinkers also encountered Diogenes' legacy. While Christianity rejected his rejection of social responsibility, it echoed his suspicion of wealth and emphasis on moral integrity. The image of a person renouncing possessions to live a virtuous life appears in early Christian ascetics. Diogenes also prefigured modern ideas about authenticity. His insistence that actions must match beliefs resonates in contemporary discussions about integrity. He rejected image and performance long before these became cultural concerns. What makes Diogenes' influence unique is that it did not rely on agreement. Many who admired him did not imitate his lifestyle. They took what they could use and left the rest. His extremity served as a boundary marker, showing how far principles could be taken. Philosophical traditions often need such figures. They clarify values by contrast. Diogenes made compromise visible by refusing it. Later thinkers could position themselves in relation to him, either by softening or adapting his ideas. The absence of written doctrine also helped preserve his influence. Stories about Diogenes allowed flexibility. Each generation could reinterpret him according to its needs. His life became a symbol rather than a system. In this way, Diogenes remained alive in philosophy, not as a set of rules, but as a challenge. He forced thinkers to ask whether philosophy was meant to comfort or confront. His answer was clear. Diogenes showed that philosophy could be lived without institutions, titles, or approval. That lesson continues to shape how people understand the relationship between thought and action. Diogenes lived more than 2,000 years ago, yet his ideas feel strangely current. In a world shaped by consumption, image, and constant comparison, his rejection of excess and performance speaks directly to modern anxieties. Diogenes matters today not because he offers easy solutions, but because he asks difficult questions that remain unresolved. Modern life encourages accumulation. Success is measured by income, possessions, and visibility. Diogenes rejected all of this. He argued that wanting less was the fastest path to freedom. This idea challenges the assumption that happiness increases with ownership. In an age of constant advertising, his message cuts against the dominant narrative. Diogenes also rejected curated identity. Today, people manage online profiles, personal brands, and public images. Diogenes refused to present himself as admirable or respectable. He lived openly, without polish. His life raises a modern question. How much of our identity is performance, and how much is real? His lantern search for an honest person resonates in an era of misinformation and surface-level communication. Trust is fragile. Public figures often say what is popular rather than what is true. Diogenes' demand for alignment between words and actions feels rare and necessary. Diogenes also challenges modern ideas of freedom. Many people live with legal rights and political choice, yet feel trapped by debt, expectations, and fear of judgment. Diogenes argued that freedom is internal. While this does not replace the need for social justice, It exposes a different layer of captivity. His life also speaks to burnout. Modern culture rewards constant productivity. Rest is treated as weakness. Diogenes refused to be busy. He valued being overdoing. This perspective questions whether endless effort leads to fulfillment or exhaustion. Diogenes' indifference to status is another modern challenge. Titles, followers, and recognition shape self-worth today. Diogenes ignored hierarchy. He treated everyone the same. This equality unsettles systems built on ranking and comparison. At the same time, Diogenes is not an easy role model. His lifestyle is not practical for most people. Few can abandon work, housing, or relationships. His value lies not in imitation, but in contrast. He reveals how many of our needs are choices shaped by culture. Diogenes also reminds us of the cost of honesty. Speaking plainly risks rejection. Questioning norms invites backlash. Diogenes accepted this cost fully. His example asks how much truth we are willing to sacrifice for comfort. His humor remains relevant. Satire continues to be one of the most effective tools for exposing hypocrisy. Diogenes understood this long before modern media. He showed that laughter can reveal truth without violence. There is also a warning in his story. Total rejection of society can lead to isolation. Diogenes chose this path knowingly. Modern readers must decide where the balance lies. His life invites reflection, not escape. Diogenes also challenges education. He believed knowledge without character was empty. Modern systems often reward information over wisdom. His emphasis on lived values remains a needed correction. In political life, Diogenes offers a reminder that power is fragile. Authority depends on belief. When people stop believing, power weakens. His indifference to rulers exposes the limits of control. Diogenes matters because he exposes illusions. Illusions about success, happiness, freedom, and respect. He does not offer comfort. He offers clarity. His life asks uncomfortable questions. What do you truly need? What are you pretending to value? Who are you trying to impress? These questions remain unanswered because they are difficult. Diogenes will never be popular. His philosophy resists packaging and consumption. That resistance is part of its value. He stands as a reminder that philosophy is not meant to soothe, but to challenge. In a world full of noise, Diogenes offers silence. In a world of display, he offers simplicity. In a world of compromise, he offers refusal. That is why he still matters.